These are the moments Prime Ministers are remembered for.
Prime Minister, have you let down Afghanistan?
No possibility of hiding behind hubris on a day like this. The Commons packed for the first time since the pandemic hit. The Prime Minister keen to make his mark on a debate about the future of Afghanistan.
Mr. Speaker, I know that members across the House share my concern about the situation in Afghanistan, the issues it raises for our own security, and the fears of many remaining in that country, especially women and children.
But he found himself almost immediately under scrutiny from his own side.
There are so many lessons to be learned from what happened over the last 20 years. Will he now agree to an independent, formal inquiry into the conduct in Afghanistan?
This was just one of a barrage of interventions from critical Conservatives, eventually brushed off.
I believe that most of the key questions have already been extensively gone into. No matter how grim the lessons of the past, the future is not yet written. And at this bleak turning point, we must help the people of Afghanistan to choose the best of all their possible futures. And in the UN, the G7, in NATO, with friends and partners around the world, that is the critical task on which this government is now urgently engaged and will be engaged in the days to come.
But more hostilities followed, firstly from the leader of the opposition, who accused him and his foreign secretary of being on holiday as Kabul fell.
You cannot coordinate an international response from the beach. A dereliction of duty by the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, a government totally unprepared for the scenario that it had 18 months to prepare for.
A former Prime Minister delivered a searing critique of the current administration.
This has been a major setback for British foreign policy. We boast about global Britain, but where is global Britain on the streets of Kabul? A successful foreign policy strategy will be judged by our deeds, not by our words.
On a day when Britain's military was at the forefront of many minds, it was those MPs who had served who spoke most powerfully, recounting personal experiences of conflict.
It is the image of a man whose name I never knew, carrying a child who had died hours earlier, carrying this child into our firebase and begging for help. Now, there was nothing we could do. It was over. Because, Mr. Speaker, this is what defeat looks like. It's when you no longer have the choice as to how to help. This doesn't need to be defeat, but at the moment, it damn well feels like it.
If Boris Johnson hoped this would be a day for the history books, he might not like some of the images that emerged. And there was more anger aimed at him on aid cuts, on the treatment of veterans, and on the government's scheme to take in 20,000 Afghan refugees.
Resettlement scheme is very welcome, but resettling from where and how? Because wars and persecution don't work to a timetable for paperwork.
There was also anger at the US from MPs normally loyal over the conduct of America and its president.
I say to the American president, you have no right to use excuses and base them on people who have lost their lives and done so bravely. The withdrawal of the air support was critical. It was done in a hurry and it was wrong.
No more foreign wars! No more foreign wars!
Outside Parliament, anti-war protesters, including some well-known faces, stood alongside military veterans and Afghan interpreters, like Rafi, who is pleading with the government to ensure other interpreters and his own family are brought to the UK and to safety.
We don't have much time. The day that the Americans and British troops, the last flight will fly, they will be butchered in the streets of Kabul. The risk is real. We need help and we need it now.
Can a debate in Westminster make a difference on the ground in Afghanistan? There are people here who are desperately hoping that it can.
Liz Bates reporting. Joining me now is the former Labour leader, now an independent MP, Jeremy Corbyn, and the Conservative MP, Tobias Ellwood, who's chair of the Commons Defence Select Committee. Welcome to both. Let me start with you, Jeremy Corbyn. You were never in favour of this military intervention. Are you relieved that it is now over?
I'm pleased if we're finally going to be out of there, but I'm appalled at what's happened over the last few days, where the mixture of incompetence by the occupying forces and the supreme danger that many Afghans are facing, and the inability of our government to say even how many refugees are going to be allowed to this country. I think we have a huge moral and political responsibility to ensure that all those people that worked for the British or American forces or contractors or anybody else does get a place of safety in our country.
But do you think we should have stayed longer? Should the Americans have stayed longer? Should we have provided more security for the Afghan forces?
Well, clearly the situation had become impossible in that the Americans had set a date for withdrawal quite a long time ago. Britain withdrew its combat role in 2014, reverted solely to a training role. Clearly there was going to be an end game at some point. The Afghan army clearly collapsed in the face of the Taliban assault over the last few days, and the Taliban are in charge. But I suspect as time goes on, the idea of a strong central government in Afghanistan may not become a reality. It'll be much more likely as a series of quite strong regional powers, almost back to the warlords of the past.
Do you think it was a waste, the whole operation?
I think the whole thing has been a complete disaster. If we think about it, we went in apparently to deal with the issues, the horrible issues of 9/11. Then the war aims changed, then they changed again, then they changed again, and it wasn't very clear what the troops were supposed to be doing there.
But it wasn't a waste for the thousands of Afghan girls and women who were able to go to school and university?
Absolutely.
Right.
Those that managed to get education, good. Those that managed to be able to develop their careers, good. But the reality is that a society in which those things a society in which...
That was it.
Sorry about that.
I think they can pick, the bike can pick you up despite that noise.
The bikes and us together,
Oh.
sure. I think the reality is that many of those young people are in enormous danger. Now, it's up to the neighbours, the regional powers, Pakistan, Iran, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Russia, China, to put all the pressure they can on the Taliban, and they're showing signs they're trying to do that.
And they have recognised, or many of the ones you've just mentioned have already recognised the Taliban government. Should we do the same now?
I don't think we should recognise until it's clear what the government is. The British tradition is to recognise the de facto position on the ground and make that the de jure position. That is not the same with the United States tradition or others. I think it's too soon to say recognise, because there is no government in place at the present time. I'm not quite sure who Russia and China have actually recognised at the moment.
OK. Tobias Ellwood, you heard Jeremy Corbyn there. I mean, the point is, isn't it, that it's not just America first, and some of us have thought it might be a little bit different under President Biden. It's not just America first, it's now America alone. And that, as your colleague Tom Tugendhat said today, leaves us in a very vulnerable position.
Well, it doesn't have to be that way. And my interpretation of what's going on in Afghanistan is very different, I think, to Jeremy Corbyn's. And our departure is causing a mass migration problem, what we've not seen since the Second World War, a humanitarian crisis, and a space for terrorism once again to flourish. But this is where I contest President Biden's interpretation of what's happening there. You mentioned 2014. Well, Britain, America, and ISAF forces have not been engaged in a war. It's been the Afghans who've been able to contain the Taliban over the last number of years because of our presence. And that has given space for the Afghan government to move forward. Now, absolutely, it's flawed. The government structure isn't appropriate for a tribal setup such as you have in Afghanistan. Nevertheless, the situation was fairly stable. And to say that we've got to bring troops home, you know, Americans have far more troops in places like Djibouti and so on. In fact, it has more personnel in the US embassy here in London than it did in Afghanistan. It became a political football to bring troops home. This is an important part of the world. And the idea that all these other countries are going to chip in, they're all going to chip in with their own agendas. China and India are not going to participate and work together. China is going to advance its relationship with Taliban in a very different direction than we would have done as well. This is a very, very dangerous civil war that will now unfold as the Northern Alliance re-emerges and takes us to civil war.
But the fact that we weren't able to persuade the Americans, if we even attempted it, to stay on a little bit longer, that they pulled the plug unilaterally, shows you, does it not, just how vulnerable and how isolated the British government is. Where does that leave global Britain, our new role in the world post-Brexit?
Well, you're right to ask that question, and I posed that in the House as well, because the Western authority, our reputation as a force for good on the international stage, particularly at the time as when the world's getting ever more dangerous, has absolutely been dented. But the bigger question here is whether Britain could have led a coalition ourselves. It's the sort of thing we used to do on a regular basis, and we should be able to do that without the United States. I should mention that militarily, the United States will not be leaving Afghanistan. They will still have an oversight, the CIA and special forces, I'm sure. Why? Because they are haunted that there'll be another terror attack planned from Afghanistan, and that they wouldn't tolerate.
Okay.
So with that in mind, this is a political judgment that was made by Trump and then advanced by Biden, and we should have stood up to this.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Tobias Ellwood. Jeremy Corbyn, just very briefly, where does that lead global Britain? Do you even believe in global Britain?
We've got to have a reassessment of our whole foreign policy strategy. Ever since the Second World War, it's been essentially side by side with the United States. That no longer exists, quite obviously, after Afghanistan. Should we, as an island of 65 million people on the northwest coast of Europe, attempt to have a global role? Isn't it time to reassess how we can help bring human rights, peace and justice around the world without occupation or invasion?
Jeremy Corbyn, Tobias Ellwood, thank you very much to you both.